As a result, Australia is also at war.
It is feared that the Prime Minister has drowned.
He has misled the Parliament.
Welcome to the Political History of Australia podcast.
Any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up the day is a bum.
I will not be lectured by this man.
Why won't you call an early election?
Mate, because I want to do you slowly. I want to do you slowly.
With your host, John Ruddick.
Episode 4, New South Wales. Last episode, James Cook and Joseph Banks were on the Endeavour. They'd been to Tahiti and they'd had a 6-month sail around New Zealand. When Cook departed New Zealand, his journal vaguely stated that he wanted to sail west to find New Holland. Banks's journal, however, states that they set out to find Van Diemen's Land a little further to the south. After 2 weeks sailing across what we know as the Tasman Sea, the crew aboard the Endeavour sighted what no European had previously seen, the east coast of New Holland. It was the 19th of April, 1770. Banks's first description was,
"The country this morn rose in gentle sloping hills which had the appearance of the highest fertility. Every hill seemed to be clothed with trees of no mean size."
Officially at least, Cook first saw today's Victorian Gippsland. But historian Margaret Cameron-Ash, in her book Lying for the Admiralty, makes an interesting case that in fact Cook was further south, near modern-day Melbourne, and Cook confirmed that Van Diemen's Land was separate from the New Holland mainland by what we know today as Bass Strait. Cameron-Ash claims that to fully understand Cook's journal, it needs to be read in the context of the day's geopolitics, the great game of espionage and deception. Cook deliberately kept that intel out of his journal. He knew it would be published and studied by the French or leaked by the crew. So, if it was a deception, why? The loose agreement among the European powers was that a claim to land covered the entire extent of the land, but did not extend to nearby but separate land. Cook wanted to claim eastern New Holland for Great Britain, and he wanted that claim to include Van Diemen's Land. Had it been confirmed that Van Diemen's Land was separated, would require 2 claims and the bother of 2 distinct settlement projects. This was not paranoia. When Bass Strait was officially confirmed in 1798, a decade after the founding of Sydney, Napoleon promptly set out an expedition to see if the French could make a claim in the area. After bumping into New Holland's east coast, Cook headed north. He was familiar with both Tasman's map and the Portuguese map, which showed that there was a passage for ships between New Guinea and the north of New Holland. Cook now wanted to fill in the gaping hole between those two. Cook made careful maps and observations about our eastern coastline. They came ashore on the 29th of April 1770, 10 days after first seeing New Holland. Cook initially named the bay Stingray Bay, but it was soon changed to Botany Bay due to the many new species of flora and fauna. They spent 8 days in that bay, which today is the location of the Sydney International Airport. Cook, Banks and a few others ventured out to inspect. Margaret Cameron-Ash again makes an interesting case that Cook's survey included a walk to a hill, today's Bellevue Hill in Sydney's eastern suburbs, and that he saw the world's finest harbour. In an age of shipping, a safe, secure harbour was a goldmine, and Sydney Harbour was the jackpot. Cook's journal doesn't mention Sydney Harbour. It has long been assumed this was because the full extent of the glorious harbour is obscured by its dog-leg-shaped entrance, and that Cook simply missed it when he sailed north after departing Botany Bay. Cameron-Ash argues Sydney Harbour was so valuable, so why tell the world about it by describing it in your journal? Why even tell the crew, who could be easily bribed by the French to cough up valuable secrets?
How could Captain James Cook, supposedly the greatest navigator of his age, have possibly failed to see coastal features as obvious as Bass Strait and Sydney Harbour? He didn't miss them, he hid them.
This demonstrates Cook's modesty. He didn't want to be remembered for these great finds, but to be a loyal servant of the Empire. Strengthening Cameron-Ash's thesis is a letter the first Governor of New South Wales, Arthur Phillip, wrote 17 years later as he was preparing the first fleet for departure, which we'll look at in our coming episode. Cook sailed out of Botany Bay, leaving an inscription on a tree with the date and details of his ship. They headed north. They sailed straight past several enticing harbours, but Cook knew he had found the best already, and he didn't want his crew to see other potential bases for a colony. As they got further north and away from good harbours, Cook and Banks made a second scouting mission on land about 400 kilometres north of what we know as Brisbane. All up the coastline, Cook consistently records seeing smoke from campfires, indicating the presence of people cooking, and keeping warm. Cook and Banks were curious about the Aboriginals, mentioning them more in this one voyage than all previous Dutch exploratory efforts combined. Cook wrote in his journal,
"From what I have seen of the natives of New Holland, they may appear to some to be the most wretched people upon earth, but in reality they are far more happier than we Europeans, being wholly unacquainted not only with the superfluous, but the necessary conveniencies so much sought after in Europe. They are happy in not knowing the use of them. They live in a tranquility which is not disturbed by the inequality of condition."
Cook was clearly influenced by Rousseau's thesis about how pre-industrial peoples are inherently good, pure, and living in harmony with nature, in contrast to the perceived corruption of civilised societies. On 10 June 1770, the Endeavour hit a coral reef near modern-day Cooktown and was taking in water fast. Fearing death, the crew worked for 24 hours to patch the leak and pump out the water. They limped towards the shore and parked on a beach for 7 weeks while working on repairs. They had mostly good relations with the local Aborigines who introduced the word kangaroo to the English language. With the ship repaired, they recommenced their journey north but sailed out into the deep ocean and away from the dangerous reef. The Endeavour was still damaged and they needed to get to Batavia to repair it. Now they considered sailing north around New Guinea, but Cook was curious to establish whether there truly was a strait between this continent and New Guinea, and that required the Endeavour to re-enter the danger of the Great Barrier Reef. We've seen at least 2 Dutch missions that had failed to establish the existence of the Torres Strait because the waters were too dangerous. 4 months after first seeing New Holland, on the 22nd of August 1770, Cook reached the very top of the continent, what we know as Cape York Peninsula, and he could gaze to the west and see the Gulf of Carpentaria. He knew that he had reached the top of the continent. He was about to venture into territory long claimed by the Dutch. If he was going to claim the east coast for Great Britain, he'd better get around to it now. Just to the west of the tip of Cape York is a little island which Cook would name Possession Island. According to his published journal, Cook, Banks and a few others jumped in a dinghy, came ashore on Possession Island and climbed up a treeless hill. It was late afternoon and there were 4 of them, Cook, Banks and 2 others. They conducted an annexation ceremony, raising the British flag, firing 3 shots and proclaiming the eastern half of the continent as British. The crew were watching below from the Endeavour and cheered. In his journal, Cook wrote,
"I now once more hoisted English colours, and in the name of His Majesty King George III took possession of the whole eastern coast by the name New South Wales, together with all the bays, harbours, rivers, and islands situate upon the said coast."
In the original draft, Cook named the land New Wales, but soon expanded it to New South Wales, which I agree, Captain Cook, does have a better ring to it. Now, it's unclear whether he added the word south because the land reminded him of South Wales, or whether it looked like Wales in general, but in the southern hemisphere. The entire east coast of this continent would be known as New South Wales until Victoria broke away in 1850, followed by Queensland in 1859. So Cook had failed to find Terra Australis, but he had completed what the Dutch had failed to do. He had mapped the vast, fertile eastern coastline of this continent. But why did Cook claim New South Wales for Britain? His mission had been to find and claim Terra Australis, and also to claim for Britain any other places where no European had visited. Neither applied to New South Wales, but he claimed it anyway. The gentleman's agreement between European powers was that the Dutch had claim to New Holland, as they had been mapping it for almost 2 centuries. Cook's rationale would have been that the Dutch did have a claim to the western part of New Holland, but not the eastern part. Now, this was in contravention of the geopolitical understanding of the day, but in Cook's defence, the Dutch had made 0 effort in almost 2 centuries to establish a colony, and the Dutch by now were a diminishing power, unlike rising Great Britain. From Possession Island, Cook sailed to Batavia, reaching it on the 10th of October 1770. The Dutch in Batavia were surprised to see how physically well the crew were after being at sea for so long. Cook was favourable to a then fringe theory that eating vegetables at sea kept the crew healthy. Batavia was a booming trade centre. Geoffrey Blainey describes it as
the most cosmopolitan of the larger towns in the world, with its crowds of Chinese, brown-skinned people from remote parts of the Indonesian archipelago, people from India and Africa, merchants from Armenia and Persia, and the mixture of Europeans.
Dutch officials quizzed Cook as to where he'd been. Cook lied. He claimed to have spent 8 months in Tahiti, but it was only 3, and to have then simply sailed directly to Batavia. There was no way Cook wanted the Dutch to know about eastern New Holland. But while sightseeing in Batavia, Joseph Banks had been told that when Bougainville had been in Batavia 2 years earlier, he had spoken of discovering many new lands. Banks then told Cook, and they were alarmed, that all their exploration of New South Wales could be redundant, as the French may have already made that claim. Writing in his journal from Batavia, Banks wrote,
"How necessary, then, will it be for us to publish an account of our voyage as soon as possible after our arrival, if we mean that our own country shall have the honour of our discoveries? Should the French have published an account of Mr. de Bougainville's voyage, will they claim the discovery as their own? If the French settle, it may be productive of very disagreeable consequences."
Now, Margaret Cameron Ash argues that Cook did not, in fact, previously conduct a possession ceremony on Possession Island. She believes the ceremony that Cook had conducted on Possession Island was merely a signal to the crew in the ship below that they had found a passage through the Torres Strait. But now Cook and Banks were absolutely freaked out that the French may have already made a claim to eastern New Holland. Cameron Ash claims Cook simply rewrote his journal and converted that minor event on Possession Island into a possession claim. She argues Cook had originally written in his journal that the island was simply named Passage Island. If true, that event atop that hill on that island could easily be rewritten because there were only 4 people there. The crew would be unable to claim otherwise. Passage Island was now Possession Island because of geopolitics. Cook in Batavia edited his journal and made the possession claim sound like a very formal and official event. The purpose was to give the edited version of his journal to a courier and get it to London ASAP. If the French had already made a claim, these efforts would at least make it contestable. But there was no emergency. As we have seen, Bougainville had come very close to North Queensland, but he hadn't come ashore, hadn't made any possession claim, and certainly had seen barely any of eastern New Holland. After getting some supplies and repairing the Endeavour, and then malaria killing 8, including sadly Tupaya, Cook departed Batavia on the 26th of December 1770 and headed for home. Malaria killed another 29 while at sea. After 3 months sailing, they sailed into the Dutch port at the southern tip of Africa. The Endeavour was docked at what we know as Cape Town for a month. At the time it was simply known as the Cape. Banks and Cooks heard more rumours about Bougainville's discoveries. The English were now keen to get home, ASAP, publish their journals and ensure their claim to New South Wales had the surest legal footing. Eastern New Holland, or what we will now refer to as New South Wales, was clearly more fertile than the rest of New Holland, but it was still unconvincing. Banks had written somewhat unfavourably in his journal about the quality of soil in Botany Bay, but the Cape opened Banks's eyes to the potential of New South Wales. How so? South America is green and lush. The Spanish had occupied South America for 3 centuries, but despite this, those Spanish colonies were often in a pitiful state. The Cape, on the other hand, was only just over a century old and a bustling commercial and agricultural success, and its surrounds were more arid than New South Wales. That was likely the moment Banks realised New South Wales too could boom. All it required was hard work and ingenuity, like the Dutch in the Cape. After the Cape, the Endeavour sailed up the west coast of Africa, heading for home. John Byron and Samuel Wallace's circumnavigations had each taken less than 2 years to complete, but the Endeavour had been away for 3 by now. Newspapers had long reported their deaths, and glum rumours circulated. But then other rumours circulated that Cook might be alive. The Admiralty was dubious. Bookmakers were taking bets on whether they would return, and on the 12th of July 1771, those who bet they would won. Cook got onto land at Deal and was taken by horse-drawn carriage to hand over to the Admiralty his journal and maps and all the other intel. He wrote,
"I've explored a long expanse of coastline, which I am confident was never seen or visited by any European before us."
But Cook was a lowly ranked naval officer known by few. The famous Banks was the toast of London on their return. The local and foreign press were praising the voyage as, quote, Banks's first voyage around the world. He was interviewed widely and gave speeches on what they had discovered. There was even a suggestion New South Wales be renamed Banksia in honour of the voyage's hero. Banks received the credit for the accurate Venus observations and for bringing back endless flora and fauna specimens. Banks was invited to brief the king, and that first meeting was the beginning of such a close friendship that Banks was given authority to oversee the king's garden. Banks soon bought property and became a close neighbour of the king, of whom he remained a trusted but informal advisor for decades to come. Cook did receive a letter of thanks for his mission from the Admiralty, and he was promoted from Lieutenant Cook to Captain Cook, and eventually given an audience with the king. Cook had told the Admiralty that he was pretty sure Terra Australis didn't exist. Banks, on the other hand, insisted it was there. Planning for yet another voyage to settle the matter began soon after their return. Young people who have met early success are prone to hubris. Banks insisted that on this next voyage, he not only get the largest cabin, but that it be enlarged for him before they departed. The ship was renovated, but that renovation backfired and made the ship unsafe, so the renovation had to be reversed, and Cook was now against Banks joining the voyage. An embarrassed Banks withdrew, but Banks and Cook put that tiff behind them, and when Cook was occasionally in London in the years ahead, they would lunch and no doubt reminisce. Cook now leaves our narrative of the political history of Australia, but let's quickly round out the remaining 8 years of his extraordinary life. He had visited New South Wales once and did not return despite 2 more voyages to the Pacific. Cook was disinterested in a second look at New South Wales, but he seems to have enjoyed resupplying and resting in Van Diemen's Land in New Zealand. Perhaps they reminded him of his boyhood in Yorkshire. On his second voyage, Cook did what John Byron, Samuel Wallis and himself had failed to do, and that is go deep down south in both the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. He confirmed Antarctica was a large continent, twice as large as Australia, but utterly uninhabitable and not Terra Australis. On his third voyage, he ventured into the deep north of the Pacific, but was killed by natives in what we know today as Hawaii. Cook was a great figure and deserves his fame, but he is also a beneficiary of the reality that tragically dying at the peak of one's fame, like Alexander or Caesar or JFK, fuels an elevation to mythical status. Banks deftly handled the PR campaign that ensured his friend would be remembered forever as one of the empire's biggest names. Across the next generation, any sailor who had sailed with Cook was spoken about in hushed tones. We have a letter from an Englishman who was a tourist in Italy, where he describes how women found him irresistible when they knew he had, quote, sailed with Cook. We're jumping ahead here, but we also need to read the last rites to our old friend Terra Australis incognito, who Cook had buried. In 1800, Sir Joseph Banks convinced the Admiralty to commission a British naval officer, Commander Matthew Flinders, to circumnavigate and map the entire continent of New Holland / New South Wales. Flinders completed that in just under a year. He had a ton of maps and notes and wanted to share it with all the boys back in London, but on his way back to London, his ship called into French-controlled Mauritius to learn that Britain and France were at war yet again, and so Flinders was kept under house arrest for 7 years. He used that time to write a lengthy report of all he had learnt. Within those writings, Flinders reads Terra Australis' obituary, and in the same paragraph, christened this continent.
There is no probability that any other detached body of land of nearly equal extent will ever be found in a more southern latitude. The name Terra Australis will therefore remain descriptive of the geographical importance of this country and of its situation on the globe. It has antiquity to recommend it, and having no reference to either of the 2 claiming nations, i.e. the Dutch and the British, appears to be less objectionable than any other which could have been selected. Had I permitted myself any innovation upon the original term, it would have been to convert it into Australia, as being more agreeable to the ear.
And so a big thank you to Commander Flinders. Terra Australis does live on in perpetuity, and yes, Australia is most agreeable to the ear. Next episode, we look at the political developments in the years after the return of the Endeavour in 1771, and the disinterest of the British to do anything about their supposed new claim. Joseph Banks, however, could not stop raving about the awesome potential of New South Wales and would not stop lobbying his friends in high places on the urgent need for a British colony to be established there.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Political History of Australia podcast with your host, John Ruddick. Click follow to receive episode notifications, and leaving a review helps others find the podcast.